Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. With the flawless execution of a special forces operation by India across the border in Myanmar, a narrative has emerged in the country that India could possibly be adopting a multi-layered policy on border and threats from the border. First, the Modi government made it known that they would adopt a policy of disproportionate responses to any firing or intrusions across the LOC. And now the cross-border raid has sparked a debate within the country and across India's neighborhood.
In one of the most serious attacks on Indian security forces in India's northeast in decades, tribal guerrillas operating out of North Myanmar ambushed a military convoy and killed 20 soldiers in Manipur. India's response to these attacks came 5 days later on 9th of June. Indian Army Special Forces, in a flawless operation, attacked rebels, destroyed 2 camps and killed at least 20 of them in Myanmar. And a terse message from the Indian Army followed.
In view of this imminent threat, it was mandatory that an immediate response was warranted. And based on the intelligence that had been gathered by us, we conducted operations to counter these attacks.
The hot pursuit in Myanmar, which the army claimed was based on credible and specific intelligence, was apparently intended for adversaries abroad.
This is a message enough for any such nation that harbors terror intentions towards our country. Be it our soil or be it our citizens anywhere in the world, they will be protected. And we will always be friendly towards countries, but when required, we will carry out strikes and we will strike at the heart of the enemy if required. If Pakistan attempts such strikes into India, we will strike back at the time and place of our own choosing.
Unexpectedly soon thereafter, Pakistan's nervous politicians and its army began warning India. Within India, a narrative soon emerged that while the military operation was well planned, the political communication was unnecessary, taking away some of the credit due to the Modi government. And even though the operation was not without precedent, it was the speed with which this attack was carried out after the ambush demonstrates a new level of confidence among India's political authorities in wielding hard power. Clearly, a new multi-layered Indian border policy is emerging. First, with the Modi government having adopted a policy of disproportionate response to Pakistani border provocations in the past 1 year. And now with this cross-border raid.
In spite of the professionalism and the speed with which India was able to execute the Special Forces operation in Myanmar, a set of narratives has emerged in the country. One, that India should continue to create a template to deal with adversaries across the border, particularly Pakistan. And the other narrative being that such operations should have remained covert and we should not have gone public with it because the fallout on our neighbors could be quite dramatic. But the big question is that do we in India have a set of military, quasi-military and non-military responses to deal with the terror threat that comes from Pakistan? And we have 2 distinguished guests with us to discuss this. Maj Gen Bakshi, author, analyst and military experience on both of India's borders and in army headquarters, and Mr. KC Singh, well-known commentator on India's foreign policy and somebody whose opinion is sought regularly on issues with regard to India's neighbors. General Bakshi, there is a view that by destroying the camps and the speed with which the Indian military operations were conducted, India has sent out a different message altogether, and the Modi government in particular, at various levels. Militarily, to boost the morale of the military. Across the neighbors, that India was willing to up the ante. And even to the political masses in the country, that yes, there is a more muscular policy in border issues. Do you agree?
Absolutely. You know, I think, Maroof, we need to view it in the context of the last 30 years when India has been at the receiving end of asymmetric offensives. First 10 years in the Punjab, and like I say, 21,000 people killed. Another 20 years in Jammu and Kashmir, another 44,000 citizens killed, soldiers, citizens. And then for 15 years, it's been a free-for-all in all the major cities of the country. For the sake of national morale, military morale, you know, as a psychological catharsis to a long-suffering Indian population, which has been getting the feeling that India is becoming a soft punching bag for almost anyone and everyone in the region who can pack a Kalashnikov. So I thought it was overdue time that a message, a clear message had to be sent thus far and no further.
Mr. KC Singh, sir, there is also a view that operations of this nature, though they weren't without precedent, such has happened in the past, but they were not boasted about or talked about. Equally, the government deserves credit, many argue, for executing flawlessly a military operation with all elements of South and North Bloc combined together in a collective approach. But it is also simultaneously argued that this message that was sent out from the political leadership, that it is for all countries, and specifically it is also focused on Pakistan, and people thought that this was a bit over the top.
Maroof, I thought the Indian Army handled it beautifully. The statement that came from the Indian Army made 3 points. They did not say it's punitive. They did not link it to the attack on the Indian soldiers. They said it was preemptive. Secondly, they said it was along the Indian-Myanmar border, leaving it vague whether it was on our side or on the Myanmari side, which means the question about the sovereignty of Myanmar or their sensitivity was taken into account. And thirdly, they said, we are in touch with the Myanmari authorities. They didn't say they were. So very subtly, they were hinting that probably Myanmar was brought in a little late, maybe as the operation started. Now, that would have given Myanmar, and that's precisely what happened. The statement which issued in the morning from Myanmar said, yes, it's a joint operation, it's been conducted, etc. Then as the chest thumping started here, because Indian Army belongs to the Indian government, Indian state. Indian Army is not a standalone army. So if the army has conducted an operation, obviously it has done so with political clearance and the credit goes to the Indian government. Now, that instead of stopping there, I think the political authorities threw a minister into the fight and he started extrapolating and expanding the argument. When the message would have already gone, the message would have gone simply from the army statement to all those to whom the message needs to be sent. And the other danger is that if you make very specific sort of threats, then the other side is A, alerted, B, starts taking countermeasures, and C, as Pakistan did, starts playing the victim. They pass a resolution in the National Assembly and start playing the victim before the global community. So it was really counterproductive and a case of overkill.
It has been argued strategically that signaling intent with demonstrative capabilities and capacity is the key to establishing and strengthening deterrence. So was this not signal enough of intent following the free hand that the armed forces and the BSF have been given in the last several months in responding to any escalation on the LOC firing, particularly from Pakistan? So this has been a long-standing lament with a lot of people, including the armed forces, that not enough message of intent was given out. Mr. KC Singh has rightly brought out the other dimension, but what's your take on the intent aspect?
You see, let me clarify. This is the era of special forces operations, and in all democratic dispensations, like the United States, these are controlled at the highest level. The Special Forces Command, in the case of the raid on Osama bin Laden, that took out Osama bin Laden at Abbottabad, the planning was done in the White House with the President, the Director CIA, the Secretary of Defense, the very top echelons available and, conducting the planning. Now, these operations were conducted in uniform. Let's please get to the connotation of the word covert. If I go in civil clothes today as a military operative and conduct operations, that truly is covert. If I'm going in my special forces Indian uniform, well, that operation is secret till the time it is conducted. Thereafter, the country is fully justified if it, sends a deterrent signal by announcing this operation. Please recall that immediately after the Abbottabad raid, starting from the US president downwards, there were a series of, you may not call it chest thumping, but a series of deterrent messages that this action had been taken, that Osama bin Laden had been killed in action, and that he had been brought to justice for what he had done on 9/11. Here is a signal of intent. You mess with us and we will get to you wherever you are. And this unambiguous signal has to be sent.
Mr. KC Singh, sir, there is another view by a commentator which says that any political establishment is understandably tempted to take credit for a successful operation of this nature. More importantly, an operation of this nature, if you take credit, could send out messages at two levels. In the case of Pakistan, which is really the point of debate in the country post-Myanmar, that it may have been a message which was probably too open for the Pakistan army not to respond to. But if it was given with the kind of openness, some believed it was strengthening the hands of the army in the Pakistani establishment by allowing them to say that we are your saviors and your guardians, the narrative that they followed for the last 67, 68 years. And instead of, if you kept quiet about it or relatively low-key, you would have perhaps allowed Pakistan to squirm out of the situation. Is that true?
I don't think every situation is identical. Each border, each neighboring country is different. The way we conduct an operation with Bhutan will be entirely different. We've done it in case of Alpha with their cooperation, active cooperation. We'll do it differently, say, with Bangladesh. We'll do it entirely differently with Myanmar. With Myanmar, because there's a history and an understanding of how these operations are conducted, it should have been left to the Indian Army to keep it within that band so that future cooperation is not affected. Because press reports that we've been seeing, I don't know how accurate they are, that actually the camps have now been moved further inland because the NSCN leader has gone to the Myanmari government and said, I need your protection. And the Myanmari government, also to ensure that there is no repeat of the breach of their sovereignty, have moved their camps further inland. Now that means the raid has been counterproductive because your future cooperation may have been affected, at least in the short run. Now, as far as Pakistan is concerned, again, if you have to do something with a country like Pakistan, it's best to do it clandestinely, keep them off guard, not broadcast it from rooftops, because Stephen Cohen said once, he says every time you say something, for instance, the cold start, he says Pakistanis take it very seriously and they will react or overreact or over-prepare for whatever happens. So even if you have to do something vis-a-vis Pakistan, sending subtle signals politically is much better than blaring with a megaphone from rooftops.
We still have our two experts with us on the show. And Mr. KC Singh, sir, is this new direction that the government is trying to establish and set out, does it mean that there are new red lines that have been defined and there is going to be less waffling and more delivery?
We don't know, but let me start that there's always a danger that if you build up an expectation that government of India will react in a very robust fashion whenever an attack comes, and then if you don't react, let me give the example of President Obama. He had laid the red line in Syria. He said if chemical weapons are used, we will step in. And then there was evidence that chemical weapons were used. And then US didn't go in. And then that starts affecting your reputation, starts affecting the validity of red lines. So laying red lines is normally not desirable. You should have options, but they need not be necessarily red lines. They should be in the mind of the person you are opposing, but not necessarily all there in the public. I think very clearly one advantage you have with Pakistan is that we have a line of control. So there is a part of the boundary that we have which is not international border. So if you're taking any action against LOC, you are not really breaching the sovereignty of that country. You have a claim to that part. You treat that as disputed territory and as your territory as per a resolution of the parliament. Therefore, you are really acting across that. Secondly, do remember that both NDA as well as UPA have gone through this cycle. Whether it was Kargil, remember that NDA specific instructions to Army and Air Force were, you cannot cross the LOC. You can take all action on this side, but not cross the LOC. So those red lines were observed even by Mr. Vajpayee. Secondly, attack on the parliament. Even then, all that India must have run through a bouquet of options. I think what we need to do is, Army and Defense Services have to develop a bouquet of options, short of going to full-scale war, and then have those available to a government. Otherwise, simply bluffing, if we find another attack comes, and then we again go through the same cycle of maximum deploying of troops along the border, or going to an alert, and things like that, then your credibility will be affected.
Many countries had begun to take India as a military lightweight, as a country that lacked the resolve to use hard power, as a country that was not going to be able to protect its vital interests effectively, despite all the military punch that we had at our disposal. And finally, the demonstration of this capability with this operation has shown that the Indian political authorities are now beginning to think differently. Is that true?
Absolutely. You see, the point that I'm trying to make is that you acquire a reputation for resolve. As the ambassador rightly pointed out, that you lay down red lines, then you are duty bound to see that you act on them, that you create the capacities, capabilities to act on those boundaries. The fact of the matter is that for 30 years, Ashley Tellis has been stating that India has acted as a sponge to absorb casualties on behalf of any and everyone around, the United States included. Now, this kind of a messaging has now to be changed, because the simple fact is that, you know, the armed forces, the security, national security complex in India has not been able to come up so far with viable answers to Pakistan's asymmetric war of 1,000 cuts. And all that we have been doing is turning the other cheek. So, you know, this amount of self-deterrence that is there in our establishment now needs to be changed. It is well on the cards that it is, you know, it's a very clear indication that things are changing. And as our capacities increase further, you know, we've had a very delayed military build-up, very much delayed by 10 years. That is catching up now. And you will find your capacities will go up and your intent is already there.
The state's legitimacy is tied to its ability to use force and operate effectively in the international environment, more so in its neighborhood, particularly in the case of India, as one hawkish commentator has written. Now, add to that is the fact that we are operating with several constraints, particularly this debate in the country has been about what can you do with Pakistan. So how do you see this message going down to Pakistan? Would it act as a restraint, or would Pakistan be willing to now test the waters a bit more to see that how much they can push their luck further with India?
Well, past experience says that the Pakistani army has a tendency to forget their past mistakes and again attempt some foolhardy thing and try it differently. And they do it every 5, 7, 8, 10 years, besides supporting asymmetric warfare. Now, I think what we need to do is to just build on General Bakshi's argument. You need to build up capabilities. One is intent and second is capabilities. If you can do pinpoint killing of, you know, there is a camp, why do you have to send Indian soldiers? And be ready for any retaliation that comes, that's all right. Do some pinpoint striking. And the answer to the international community will be, this is an area where Pakistan is not controlling it. US have already set an example on their western frontier. Pakistan is not doing more than just token objecting to it. So why are they objecting to our taking it out? Either they take care of a camp or we take it out. So similarly, build up capabilities which we don't have today. And capabilities are noted by your adversaries. And the capabilities are there, that starts conditioning their behavior. You don't necessarily, as they say, the best way to avoid a war is to be prepared for one. So I believe best way to avoid terrorism is to be prepared for it, which means go up the ladder of being prepared through the complete range from cyber to drones to everything else, which separates you from Pakistan so that the differential of power between you and Pakistan becomes so tremendous, which is inevitable, taking the relative size of the two economies, that over the next 4 or 5 years, increase the gap to an extent that they don't think of retaliation.
Well, a lot of important points have come out, as expected, on this extremely sensitive and current subject, which needs answers. And I think, to sum up, I could probably lay my finger on 5 key issues. One, that this is now the era of special forces, and the use of special forces as exhibited in Myanmar is different from the use of covert operatives who do not go in military uniforms but operate covertly, and the whole exercise has to be kept secretive for a long, long time. So a special forces operation has to be controlled at the highest level and has to have sanction from the highest level and needs to be done from time to time to exhibit your new military resolve. The second is that not every situation on India's border is going to be identical. What applies to Bangladesh and Bhutan would not apply to Myanmar, and what applies to Myanmar would necessarily not be replicated to Pakistan. But new alternatives and new bouquet of options need to be provided by the armed forces to the Ministry of Defense and in turn to the Cabinet and the Prime Minister to then be able to exercise those should the contingency arrive, God forbid, in the near future. But equally importantly, don't spell out red lines that you're not going to be able to honor and keep in future, because the chest thumping with the definition of who is an enemy and who's not and what you're going to do raises public expectations on which governments then find difficult to deliver in the long run if the situation is more complicated than what it was in Myanmar. And finally, that there are options against Pakistan short of using special forces or heli-borne troops to go and attack camps. Technology provides us those options. Those options must be studied, and a new security narrative needs to emerge, starting with options, finally to the political diplomatic delivery that we as a country can look at in future. Thank you very much for all your points, and thank you very much, sir, for being with us on this show. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye.